Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Halloween episode of Ask Professor Paranormal. My producer, Graveyard Grog, insisted I wear my Starfleet uniform for this. Kind of an odd thing considering what I'm talking about, but a lot of what we do actually in parapsychology is more the realm of science fiction than it is horror. And to that end, I want to welcome everybody here to the future of psychic phenomena and the past, of course. As always, I am happy to answer questions, but I thought tonight, since Halloween is coming up, I might tell a few ghost stories or stories of some of my experiences and cases, just a little bit. I know you're not getting the full brief of the uniform at this point, but then again, I prefer to stay seated at this moment. Hi, Sandra. Hi, Paul. Good to have you here, and I know that we have a few others here. So at some point, I'd love to hear what people are doing for Halloween, but I just want to say that it's a pleasure to continue to do this. We're back on the every other week schedule starting tonight. So we'll be going through the end of the year and into January every other week now. So don't have anything kind of blowing up at this point. And I do hope that folks are planning something fun for Halloween. Merry Prankster. Live long and prosper, or I should say peace and long life. All right, so tonight, until I get stories, if I get stories, not stories, questions, I'm happy to kind of talk about a few of my cases. Now, some of them, I might touch on a couple of things that were written up in my paranormal casebook, a paranormal casebook. I am planning a second volume, and I'll have some other stories in that, some other cases. And I don't write up every one of my cases. I don't actually tell the story of every one of my cases because many of them don't have any unique features to them. And I think it's more interesting and provides more to learn from if they happen to be stories that include something unique. Either the clients are unique, the setting is unique, or the phenomena itself, the activity is unique. The solution is unique. So that's pretty much what we tend to go with as much as possible. So first, I thought I'd tell you a couple stories that were told to me, one of which we really did check out a little bit later, kind of on site as well. So this was a case that came out of, or a story that came out of actually a local TV show. Back in the 1980s here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we had a couple of local daytime talk shows. We had People Are Talking, we had AM San Francisco, we had, what was it? Can't remember what the afternoon, it was just called the afternoon show now that I think about it. I actually got to do an episode of the afternoon show with Ellen DeGeneres when she was still doing stand-up. So I did a number of those talk shows, especially People Are Talking. They were friends of JFK University in many respects. Had me on a whole bunch of times. Ross McGowan was the main host of that. And one of the episodes that I did, a woman and her son, her adult son, were in the audience. And of course, occasionally they would ask the audience for their ghost stories. And she proceeded to talk about the fact that they had a maid who was a spirit. So in other words, they had a spirit maid, somebody who was cleaning up their house for them. Or she, if I recall correctly, she might have actually even said elves or something like kiddingly for that. So she explained that she and her son would leave the house, and not that it was that messy. They come back and things were tidied up. It looked like things had been vacuumed. Things completely dusted. So that was very, very intriguing. I mean, it's always a fun story when you hear something like that. That was the only phenomenon that was happening, by the way, and they never actually saw a ghost or experienced anything else. So a couple of my folks, I took a couple of the students from JFK University down to the South Bay to go to the house. And we went into the house with them, the woman and her son, had them mess things up a little bit, even put some dirt on the floor. The vacuum cleaner was in the closet. There was no one else in the house. And I will say, by the way, they never got anything out of this other than our confirmation. So it was not like they had a secret room where somebody was hiding. They were hiding a maid. So we went outside the house and had people kind of not around the whole house, but pretty much covering all the exits and entrances to the house. We waited a couple hours with the couple, with the woman and her son. We go back inside, And the place has been vacuumed. The place has been dusted. Things have been rearranged. The furniture's back where it was. Things have been picked up off the floor. Go figure. That's about as far as we got with that. The one thing they did not want anyone getting rid of that ghost. And I don't blame them, because I think if all of us could have a ghostly housekeeper, not have to pay them, we'd be very happy to engage that particular individual. So that was one story that we did check up on. Another one, which I sort of checked up on, was told to me by a producer at the Joan Rivers Show back in 1989. They did an episode of the Joan Rivers Show, which is up on my other YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Lloyd Auerbach. And it was a really good episode, the timing of which was very bizarre, because it was the morning after the 1989 earthquake here in the Bay Area. I had just flown into New York. And one of the other people who was on the show, one of the people who had experiences also from the Bay Area, and we were fortunate in some respects, not that the earthquake was fortunate, but her husband worked for AT&T and had a satellite phone. It was actually calling her to give updates as to what was going on in the Bay Area for us. In any event, this producer came up to me after the show. He had a really interesting conversation with a good friend of his, also a producer in LA, a couple of years before, and he just wanted to relate this story to me. And the story goes that this producer friend of his was out driving his car in the canyon. So I think it was somewhere like Laurel Canyon or somewhere like that in the Hollywood area. And he ran off the road. He kind of ran off the road down a ravine. So the car tumbled over and over again. You know, cars don't ever really explode like you see on TV, at least not normally. So that didn't happen. But because of his seatbelt and because it ended up roof side down, he really couldn't get out. He had a German Shepherd with him in the car that was not certainly seatbelted. And the car was slightly, he could see even in the back, it was crushed. He was really tight in that car. Fortunately, within a couple of minutes, people did come down the hill to the car and were able to wrench open the door and pull him out. And one of the people said to this guy, "It's a good thing your dog stopped traffic." So there wasn't a lot of traffic going up and down. Nobody saw him go off the road. "It's a good thing your dog stopped traffic. Your German Shepherd was in the middle of the road barking to stop us and led us down the hill." So the guy was really thankful, of course. And as they pull him out of the car, they're shifting the weight of the car, and the car just kind of tilts, and they can see very clearly that the man's German Shepherd was crushed. Now, the odds of there being another German Shepherd in the area, stopping cars, leading it down to that area, and then vanishing, because that's what happened. When the dog let them down, the dog was nowhere to be seen, is pretty astronomical against that. So this man was very, very thankful that his German Shepherd, his pet, saved his life as a last act before moving on to wherever they go. And we occasionally have heard stories like that of animals, pets, either saving or coming back, of course, after death. That's always a really interesting thing. I'll tell you one more animal story from my friend Ankasha, who's a really good psychic. And then we can take a question or two, and I can move on to a couple of other stories. So this is still a ghost story. Ankasha, when for a number of years, she currently lives outside of Seattle these days. And she was living in Minneapolis area and actually doing some workshops at a bed and breakfast not too far away. So it was kind of like a haunted weekend. The building itself was supposed to be haunted. She would do psychic development workshop with them as well. And the woman who owned the bed and breakfast had a cat. And in some way, somehow, this cat would get into the guest rooms, even if the door was closed. People would sometimes wake up in the morning with the cat on the bed or the cat in the room with them. They could never figure out how that cat actually got. This is a living cat, by the way. So Ankasha would do these things every few months. And one month she was there and she woke up in the morning and there's the cat nuzzling her. So she opens the door to let the cat out. And when she goes down for breakfast, she mentions to the owner, the cat was somehow ended up in the room again. And the woman looked at her and very seriously said, well, that's not possible. She died 3 months ago. So apparently the ghost cat was still behaving the way the cat did when alive. Now, it could have been a haunting, but according to Ankasha, that cat did interact with her until she let her out of the room. It just makes me wonder how that cat actually got into the room. So I do hear ghost stories from credible sources from time to time. Some of them we can check out, some of them we cannot. But those are all pretty interesting as well. Susanna, you say you were living in the Bay Area that year, was there during the earthquake. I missed the earthquake. I guess I'm fortunate. Then again, it was very, very surreal having flown into New York. And actually, I was having dinner with my parents at their house, and my dad had the TV on because it was the World Series. And that was the Giants and Oakland A's World Series. It was the kind of Bay Area series. And things went out. The signal went out, and the earthquake comes across, and we start watching TV, and we're only seeing the horrible situation on the Bay Bridge, the Cypress structure, which collapsed. That's the part that killed the most people, and then the fire in the marina, and that's all we saw. Fortunately, the next day, I was getting much better reports in general, and I know the building I was working in, downtown San Francisco, the only damage that even occurred in that building, because a lot of the downtown San Francisco buildings are on rollers, was there were filing cabinets that tilted over because the drawers opened up and then fell over. And then people lost a lot of mugs on their desks, but nothing to bring down the terrible thing that happened with the Cypress structure, which was part of the freeway outside of Oakland, that it turned out had been built incorrectly with the incorrect materials according to plan. They'd not been built according to plan. So, contractors, again, and that's the case, or politicians being bribed somehow during the 1950s. Okay, Susanna says, not a haunting, but a friend and her animals started running chaotically around the yard. Maybe they picked something up. It's kind of hard to say whether that's that. Is it true it takes energy for ghosts to appear, and it is rare because they don't have enough energy to do so? That's just a myth. We have no idea what so-called energy ghosts actually need. We do know that it's not a manifestation, and the appearance is not visual. Ghosts are not optical. They are psychic phenomena. In other words, we pick them up visually because we are psychically perceiving them that way. You can say that they're putting out a signal, they're broadcasting, but not everybody sees the same ghost the same way or experiences the same ghost the same way. So sometimes one person might hear the ghost voice, another person might see the ghost. People in the same room might feel a presence, and others might experience nothing. So, and it's situations like that that make it pretty clear that there's something more going on than what used to be called manifestation by the spiritualists. This whole idea of cold spots, it's very rare for an actual temperature change to be measured when people feel cold chills. That can happen in other circumstances, but it's not uncommon for people to feel a cold chill when an apparition or haunting phenomena is being experienced. So a little different. So Mary Prankster, you're Mexican in the Mexican tradition, the Day of the Dead. October 27th is the day the deceased pets are believed to return. I didn't even know that. I knew about the Day of the Dead, but I didn't know that pets were allowed to come back that way as well. There are plenty of experiences of pet ghosts. We saw one of our cats after he died for quite some time. Not full-blown apparition, but just kind of like with the other cats outside, very clearly outside, and this cat was different color, just kind of moving quickly through the room. So, and I've talked to a lot of people, and there are actually a couple of books on animal ghosts out there as well. And then the whole idea that animals are more psychic than us is no more true than saying that kids are more psychic than us. Animals have to pay attention to it. They have different perceptions than us. They can actually perceive things we cannot in the physical environment. They don't have to be paranormal. But animals have some really unique psychic abilities. If you've ever heard of psi trailing, That's when somebody moves very far away, having left their pet behind, and somehow the cat or dog goes sometimes even across country, but hundreds of miles to find their owner, who is in a place they've never been before. The animal's never been before. But there are some other ones where they find their way home. There was actually a cat that found her way home, or his way home, from Yellowstone, 800 miles. The cat kind of went out of the trailer and disappeared in the woods, and they thought the cat was gone. Cat showed up a few weeks later at home. So some kind of homing sense or something else there. Susanna, you were at the University of California, Berkeley, stood on the floor. It felt like logs rolling into the concrete floor. That's what it felt like when I did experience earthquakes, bigger earthquakes in the building in San Francisco. The building kept on rolling for that. In fact, a friend of mine who was in the building during 1989 quake said the building didn't stop rocking for well over 5 minutes. It was very bizarre. Anyway, have I heard of Rebecca Watson? She has a YouTube channel. I've not heard of her. She was a skeptic, claims to be University Division. She may be part of the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. Oh, she claims the University of Virginia Perceptual Studies is pseudoscience. Yeah, she's a pseudo-skeptic. If she has not, the odds are she has not had communication or many communications with, or any communication with, the folks at DOPS, the Division of Perceptual Studies, which is in the medical school, by the way. And it's likely she hasn't looked at the research at all. So when people start tossing around pseudoscience, the first thing you have to ask is, what research reports have you read? And what data have you looked at? And the odds are they haven't looked at any data or minimal data, or they're cherry picking the worst situations, or refuse to consider that there might be an alternative explanation. Even some of the most materialist parapsychologists have a hard time explaining, and even people like Carl Sagan had a hard time explaining children remembering previous lives. That was one of a few phenomena that Carl Sagan cited in his book. I think it was The Dragons of Eden, and he was a diehard skeptic. I mean, not even a skeptic. He was a critic of the field. But he felt that remote viewing was worthy of study. Gonsfeld was worthy of looking at. Most importantly, he said that children remembering previous lives absolutely needed study. And any study of that is scientific, if you do it right. They're not doing past life regressions or anything like that. They're taking a very methodical approach there. So just, when I hear people calling our field pseudoscience, it means they've not looked at the science at all. Let's see. Bobby is a well-known story about a collie. Lassie come home based on that. Yeah, I remember reading about that. There was also there have been several cases. I'm trying to remember the case of there was a cat back in the 60s or 50s that I had researched because I was asked to talk about that particular case on an episode of The Unexplained. Or maybe it was Weird or What, but I think it was The Unexplained. Yeah, it was The Unexplained with William Shatner. It's one of the first season episodes on animals, which is on, I think it's on Netflix, or might be on some of the other streaming services as well. There are lots of examples of the side trailing piece as well. And they're always kind of laughed off as the animals followed a scent, which is bizarre if they're driving or on a plane. There's so many different examples of how scientists look at data or situations in other fields, and even with other divisions of their own field or other theories, their perceptual biases and their belief systems get in the way of even considering alternative explanations. We certainly see that in the ghost hunting world. And people have said that I'm not considering alternative explanations, but the ones I don't consider are contradictory or just are not supported by the evidence of 140 years of research and investigation in the field of parapsychology. So if somebody is showing me evidence from a TV show, that's not how TV works, generally. I mean, otherwise, I could just, walk in and turn on my tricorder, and so the sound's not working on this thing right now. Huh. I guess I need new batteries. Oh, there we go. I don't know if you can hear that, but it is flashing a little bit. Anyway, let me move on to another story unless folks have a question. Something completely different. Let me see here. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about, actually, let me jump to a couple of things that connect to my late friend Martin Caidin. So Martin Caidin, for those of you who don't know the name, which is probably most of you, Martin Caidin was a science and science fiction writer. He wrote over 200 books. A number of them were nonfiction. Several of them were aviation related. Many of them had to do with air races of World War II. There were books on space science. He was writing books on space science as far back as the 1950s. He was actually covering some of the early space shots for Metro Media TV. He lived in the Cocoa Beach area, and then eventually ended up becoming a kind of unofficial consultant to NASA. When I got to know him in the early 90s, he was absolutely a consultant to NASA, even if it was still unofficial, because I was at his place in Cocoa Beach a number of times when he would get calls from somebody over at NASA, usually in the PR or marketing group, asking to confirm a point of history for NASA. Marty had pretty much knew everything and knew everybody. He was friends with the astronauts. There are some pretty funny stories actually as well. He also wrote a book in the 1960s called Marooned, novel, which included a disaster aboard an Apollo-type spacecraft and a rescue mission that was a joint mission with the Soviets, the Soyuz. So a couple of things about that's pretty interesting. It was made into a movie with Gregory Peck in 1968, won an Academy Award, not for Best Picture, but for something technical, I believe, maybe music. And what's interesting about that movie is the faults that happened in the capsule, the problems, pretty much predicted what was going to happen with Apollo 13. When I talked to Marty about that, after I got to know him, he said that the problems with the craft partly came from predictions that Sybil Leek made in the 1960s. Sybil Leek was a writer on the paranormal and the occult. She called herself the White Witch of England, claimed to be like seventh generation Wiccan queen of England. That was not true. But she did operate in that world quite a bit. She eventually, at some point, moved to Cocoa Beach, which I had only heard for the first time from Marty, and even became friends with the astronauts, some of the astronauts' wives, did astrological charts for them. And she did a chart for each of the Apollo missions and didn't get some great information back on the chart she did from Apollo 13. These were all well in advance. That was all after Apollo 1 blew up on the pad. So the story goes, according to Marty, is that her predictions he claimed were in a safe in NASA, a copy of them, but he took the information and kind of built some of the story around that as well. And then Apollo 13 happened, which is very bizarre. Martin Caidin also wrote a book called Cyborg, because he claimed there was an Air Force bionics program. And Marty had been in military intelligence at one point. So Cyborg became the $6 Million Man TV series. Marty was the technical consultant for the first couple of seasons and was involved. He even had a cameo in the fifth season episode. And he was instrumental in creating the Bionic Woman as well. So when I got to know him, it was because he was at a conference on the unexplained. He had written a book called Ghosts of the Air, which you can find. And I recommend that book quite a bit. It's about UFO sightings and mysterious phenomena cited by pilots, aviation people. Marty was nothing if not a well-known aviation expert. And we got to know each other very well from the beginning, partly because he knew my dad 30 years before. My father worked for NBC covering the Mercury and Gemini space shots, so he knew Marty a little bit. And the other thing was Marty claimed to be able to do psychokinesis, to mind over matter, and he did it. And then invited me to his home, first in Gainesville, and he lived there, and then to Cocoa Beach. So I visited him a number of times there before he got very sick with cancer and passed away in 97. Well, before he passed away, and actually it was when I was at his place, this was in 1993. It was actually, I visited him already and was coming back a couple months later. And when I was back there in early July in 1993, he had a story to tell me, which we then got on the phone with the appropriate person. It was actually later in July that we actually did this. So it was, I think it was somewhere around towards the very end of July. I went there a few times. So I'm going to just read you just some facts here. This was about a former Mercury 7 astronaut by the name of Deke Slayton, Donald K. Slayton. And Deke Slayton died June 13th, 1993 at 7:57 a.m. Pacific time. All right. So that's kind of important to know. He died of cancer. He had a number of mobility issues. And actually, I'm sorry, he didn't die in Pacific time. He died 7:57 a.m. Texas time, because he died in Texas. And that was I'm mixing up the times. So this is June 13th, 1993. He died 3:22 a.m. Central Time in Texas. Again, June 13th. At 7:57 a.m. Pacific Time, so that would have been 9:57 a.m. Central Time, in Southern California, on that same day, a Formula One racing plane with the registration, very large registration numbers on it, N21X, took off from John Wayne Airport, which is Orange County Airport. Now, a couple things about that. It was a racing plane. It had a high-speed propeller that made a lot of noise. And there are noise regulations for that particular airport, in and around that airport at the time. So this plane was seen on the ground by a number of folks. It was seen by the tower as it took off and flew into the sunrise. So it flew east into the sunrise. It disappeared after performing some flight maneuvers that were witnessed by people. On July 20th, Deke's wife, Bobby Slayton, received a letter in the mail that was July 20th. It was dated June 28th, so it was a couple weeks after the death of Donald K. Slayton. The letter said that Deke Slayton was cited for a noise violation for violating FAA regulations on June 13th, 1993 at 7:57 a.m., which is several hours after he died. All right. Bobby Slayton told Martin, because she called him about this, and then I talked to Bobby as well. But Bobby told both of us that she called the FAA rep and said, "Are you crazy?" He was dead, and he was in Texas. More importantly, what she said was that plane, which was not only identified by the letters on the fuselage, but also by the painting of the plane, that particular aircraft, at the time it was seen in Orange County, was actually in an aircraft museum since March 1993 in Sparks, Nevada, without the engine in the craft. That was Donald Clay Slayton's, his racing plane. So now, the plane was cited as taking off on its own. There was no one on the tarmac near the plane as the plane warmed up. No one at all. Of course, they couldn't see in the cockpit. They don't know who was in there, if there was anyone. So the question then becomes a couple of things. Number one, that particular motor, that particular engine required someone to spin the propeller, kind of like old-fashioned way. It couldn't be started just from inside the cockpit. And there was nobody there to do that. And number two, that plane was in a museum in Sparks, Nevada. So how is it possible that that plane could have shown up there for that? Now, the only other possibility is somehow the timing just happened to be right No one that morning knew that Deke Slayton had died. Only Bobby Slayton, their daughter, and a doctor died at home. Those are the only people who knew for many hours after. So even if this was someone playing homage to Deke Slayton for some reason, with a plane that was the same kind of plane, making the same noise at the same airport that it used to be housed, how did that person know to take off shortly after the death? So, plus the fact that the plane disappeared off radar. That's another piece that happened. So the story itself indicates that perhaps Deke Slayton was somehow making a last pass for his history. Bobby Slayton did mention that, again, there was no one there to turn the propeller, and the plane was there warming up for quite some time. And Bobby made a comment about possibly Deke waiting for Gus Grissom, who was one of the astronauts who died in the Apollo 1 disaster on the pad. That particular story, was a two-part miniseries from TBS based on the book Moonshot by I'm trying to remember who wrote that, one of the other astronauts. And there's a lot of books called Moonshot, but this is one specifically about that was co-written with Jay Barbary, I believe. And in that TV miniseries, the last sequence is this ghost story of the plane taking off. So a pretty interesting little story. I'll also mention another story. So Marty was pretty amazing in terms of being able to do some PK under really controlled condition. I wasn't the first person to do research with him. I talked to some NASA people who had done some research with him. I talked to other people who had worked with him under controlled conditions. It wasn't like he was doing a lot. He was turning these little paper targets that were balanced on a spindle, but he did them outside, sometimes an isolation room, which he had in his home in Gainesville. And according to some of the folks that I talked to, there was even a circumstance where the targets were placed inside an atmosphere chamber so that they could lower the density of the air to 1/100th of an atmosphere. They had a fan inside, which they had remote control. The fan couldn't turn the target. Marty was asked to turn the target at certain times. The target inside started turning. So there were some really interesting things we worked with. And I actually wrote him up in my book, Mind Over Matter, for this. And he had a method which was contradictory to what we usually see on TV. Very, very different method, in fact. And I've done it on occasion. I've taught people to do it on occasion. Really interesting. Marty also came on a couple of investigations with me. And he had his own investigations he had done at various places in the Florida area. Some really interesting experiences that he had, not to mention his wacko stories with him and the astronauts. They were kind of party animals in some respects. And when he got sick, he actually lasted 1.5 years longer than the Mayo Clinic gave him. It was Alan Shepard. Thank you. My brain went blank. Alan Shepard and Deke Slayton. Marty Caidin had a lot to do with the writing of that book too, kind of in the background, apparently. But the Moonshot series is really good if you can find it. So Martin pretty much kind of survived for the extra 1.5 years beyond what the Mayo Clinic said when they said his cancer had spread throughout his body. And basically, he felt very strongly that doctors should never give someone an expiration date. He actually told me, I don't know if he really did this, but he said he was calling the doctors at the Mayo Clinic who gave him the final diagnosis, the prognosis. He called them every week and basically told them where to go. Told them to F off every week. I don't know if he did it, but knowing Martin Caidin, he probably did. And probably the doctors were happy to hear from him. So when he finally passed away, and I should mention that before he passed away, he always said to me many, many times, when I come back, I'm going to haunt you, Auerbach. So I want to address a little bit of a skeptical piece. Most people who see apparitions or have experiences with ghosts, it happens within 1 to 3 days after the death of a loved one. And so what I hear from skeptics is, well, those people were expecting. It was suggestion, all of that. Yeah, I was expecting Martin Caidin to come back and pop in on me. And since most apparitions appear to people who are friends, loved ones, relatives within 1 to 3 days, and usually closer to the time of death, I expected that. I got a call from D.D. Caden. I, said my mental goodbyes to him, took the 3 shots of rum that I promised him I'd do on hearing about his death, and waited, and nothing happened for a week. Still nothing. Week and a half goes by. I'm thinking, yeah, by that time, I wasn't expecting anything. I mean, honestly, I was hoping at some point that one of the mediums I knew, we might be able to connect, but I was absolutely not expecting anything. I was driving in the morning, weekday morning, to the Oakland airport to fly up to Portland, Oregon. And for whatever reason, there was a light traffic going through Oakland. And my car was, just to let you know, my car was about 3 months old. It still smelled new. And all of a sudden, my car started filling up with the smell of very stinky cigar smoke. And it was identifiably the kind of smoke or smell that I associated with Martin Caden. It was his brand, you could say. I also felt a presence sitting next to me in the passenger seat. And this is about 7 o'clock in the morning. And I start talking to him because it just, in my head, it has to be Martin Caden. I pretty much said my goodbyes, and then it went away. So I fly up to Portland. I get there later in the morning, and I pick up a pay phone at the airport, because this is pre-cell phone days, not too far before cell phone, but I didn't have one yet in 97. It's March 1997. Called a friend of Marty's by the name of Bob Button, who was a pilot friend that Marty knew from New Jersey. And I had met Bob a bunch of times. He was visiting down to Florida when I was there. I met several other pilots who were friends of Marty's. And so I decided to call Bob because I had his number and I'd spoken to him a few times when Marty was sick. And before I could say anything other than, "Hi, Bob, it's Lloyd Auerbach," I hear him say, "Well, Lloyd, you must be psychic." And of course I said, "Yes, I am, Bob. Why do you say that?" He said, "Well, I was flying my Cessna this morning here in New Jersey, and about 10:10 this morning, I was alone in the cockpit, nobody else in my plane. My cockpit fills with the smell of cigar smoke. It was definitely Caden's brand. And I swear he was sitting next to me. And I talked to him, didn't hear anything, but as soon as I was done saying my goodbyes, it's gone." So then I told Bob my experience. And Bob said, "That's really interesting. So you said it happened at 7 o'clock. And I said, "Yeah." He said, "That's 10 o'clock Eastern time." I said, "Yeah." His happened at 10:10. Then he says to me, "Well, I got off the phone a little while ago with a test pilot friend of ours, his and Marty's, named John Tracy. And at 10:20, he's flying a plane alone. And the exact same thing happened to him." So all 3 of us, one right after the other. I said to Bob, "Why did it take him so long?" It was a week and a half. And Bob just kiddingly said, "Well, Caden, he knew people all over the world. Clearly, we were not first on the list." Well, it turned out, because Bob did a lot of checking, 25 of us on either side of that day had, if alone in an aircraft or in a car, had the exact same experience. Not the experience any of us would have expected. We would have, I think, all expected Marty to come and show up and yell at us or something like that. That's not what happened. But it's one of the few I can say that was a real connective experience that I've had myself. Okay. All right. Before I move on to a couple of other stories, I thought maybe I'll tell you a little personal anecdote too, another one. But questions, anybody? We're kind of moving through this. This is a little bit one-sided at this point. So normally I do answer questions for anybody who might be new tonight. And I'll give it a moment, and then I'm just going to launch into something else. And I guess I'll launch into something else, but feel free to put a question in there if you got it. I do want to say something about my father, Dick Auerbach, who was with NBC and then on his own for quite some time as a producer, mostly a for majority from about 1964 till his death in 2006. He was involved in sports production in some way, shape, or form. And Susanna, it was just the scent, no actual smoke. Otherwise, that would have been visually difficult for me. And there wasn't a lingering scent in the car afterwards either. All right, so my father had some interest, a little bit of interest in what I was doing. And actually, I had a lot of interesting discussions or or conversations with people in the media, including the news media, growing up. I can say that I spent a lot of time at 30 Rockefeller Plaza growing up. We lived in the New York area. My dad worked out of there, traveled a lot for NBC Sports for many years. He actually produced a couple of the Olympics there as well for NBC before he left in 1980. And then he produced the Tournament of Roses Parade and the Rose Bowl every year through 2002, as well as other sporting events here and there and other kinds of events until he retired. So he passed away in 2006, actually rather suddenly. He ended up in the ICU. I had just seen him in New York a week before, flew back to New York over the course of the next few days, he passed away. So he was in a hospital in Peekskill, New York. My parents were living 5 minutes from the hospital at the time, so I was staying with my mom. And we got a call on the day of his death at 4 o'clock in the morning to come to the hospital because his organs were failing and they were going to call it. We called my brother Ron, who lived at the time in Scarsdale, New York, and then my brother David, who to this day still lives in Brooklyn, to come to the hospital as soon as possible. And we went right over to the hospital. They were going to wait to call, to more or less pull the plug or to stop, to kind of call his death until after at least my brother Ron got there. It was going to take too long for David to get there. So we waited a half hour. Ron came. We're in the ICU saying goodbye to him. I don't even know how conscious he was at the time, but he passed. And my mother and my brother Ron start walking down the long hall to the waiting room to wait for my brother David shortly after 5 in the morning. And I just stayed behind. I felt, again, this could be suggestion, but I felt his presence. And I kind of mentally said, gave him instruction of what to do. I've been around this stuff long enough. I even called on a couple of the ghosts from cases I've had to come and kind of help him along if necessary. And then I kind of caught up with my brother and my mother, and we walk into the waiting room. There is no one else in the waiting room. The TV is off, but as we walk in, the TV turns on. It changes channel to a sports channel. And my brother Ron kind of sharply looked at me. My mother just knew what was going on, and I knew it was my dad. I did check. It was not on a timer, wasn't a timer for it. It couldn't have changed channel anyway, and there wasn't another remote control that was there. So I see, when we hear about people at the time of their death, sometimes people experience a visual or an auditory thing, even whether it's local to the body where the person's dying or somewhere else. We have apparitions that appear sometimes all over the country to people who are relatives. On occasion, there's something physical that happens. A picture shatters or falls off the wall. Something moves that related to that person. There's different kinds of those kinds of PK events, kind of last bit PK events. But that was definitely one for the books for me. And I did have communication with him later on from a couple of mediums. In fact, from Marty as well. And it was kind of good to hear. A medium named Sandra O'Hara was surprised to find not only my dad, but also Martin Caden pushing through. They knew each other in life, although it was many years before. They also knew each other in death, which was good to see for me. Okay, let me move on to another story. We're 15 minutes after the hour. All right, so let me tell you, and some people have heard this story before, but I thought it's always good to hear a completely different kind of story. So when I was living in New York in the early 80s, working at the American Society for Psychical Research, if there were cases that came in, even though it was not my role, I was not part of the research team, I was on the education in the education department as well. And however, I did follow the research that Carlos Osis and Donna McCormick were doing. I got to know Alex Tanis, who was the psychic that was working with research and also going out on investigations with Osis and McCormick. And whenever call came in for Westchester County, because I lived in Westchester, I would be the front man. I would go and check things out first and possibly only. So we got a call from this couple that said that they have these really bizarre footsteps happening around between 10:30 and 11:30 at night from the attic. And they would pull down the attic stairs and go up into the attic, and there's nothing there. And the guy checked for animals, and he didn't see any signs of animals at all. Actually, I don't think he checked hard enough. It's a different story. But they were really freaking out a little bit that these footsteps were kind of happening the same over and over again. And to me, it sounded like a haunting, a residual haunting. But I was going to go up there and see what was going on. So I went up late, probably got up there around 9 o'clock, sat down and talked to them, got some timing issues on them, find out when it started, got all the basics that one needs to get from a witness. Something I don't see people on TV doing. So then I said, okay, I'm going to go up to the attic. It's before the time that this usually happens, which was closer to 11 o'clock. I have a flashlight with me. I'm going to go up in the attic. And I went up with the guy first. And it was a very rough floor. It was, not a finished attic. So it wasn't like there were walls and stuff. It was kind of really the roof you could see, the rafters and things. And you could only stand up in the center of the room pretty much. But the floor was solid. It wasn't just insulation like I see in a lot of homes, including my own here. So I find a spot I'm going to sit down, and the guy goes down. I said, I'm just going to hang out up here. I'll turn off the light, and I'll just wait and see if I can hear the footsteps from up here. If you hear the footsteps downstairs from right below, because I don't want you to leave that area, I want you to yell up at me and let me know. So I'm waiting and I'm waiting and I'm waiting, and it's pretty boring, and I can't even put on music or anything else. Staking things out can be the worst part of doing investigations. And all of a sudden I hear some scratching sounds from across the attic, because I'm actually against the kind of tilted wall. And then I hear a slight thump, and I hear a little more scratching and a slight thump. And I'm hearing this kind of regular, it's happening in a regular rhythm, coming towards my direction. As it's getting towards the center of the attic, the guy downstairs yells, "Do you hear the footsteps? Do you hear the footsteps?" And I'm not hearing footsteps. I'm hearing a light thump. And it gets closer and closer. And when it got close enough, maybe about 3 or 4 feet from me, I turned on the light. And I was very fortunate it was a squirrel, and not anything worse. It was a squirrel rolling a nut across the rough floor, and it was bouncing. That was the thump. And and I scared the squirrel away. Completely scared the squirrel away. The guy yells downstairs, "It stopped. It stopped. Are you okay?" So I'm looking around without saying a word yet, and I find a pile of nuts. Now, this was the fall. I guess the squirrel was squirreling things away for the wintertime. So I grabbed one of the nuts and I decided to try something. Sometimes you have to do things just for yourself. And I kind of skipped it like a stone across the floor. I rolled it pretty hard, and it did a bunch of thumps and bounces, not very loud. And the guy and his wife are screaming, yelling, "Are you okay? Are you okay? It sounds like there's a whole bunch of people up there." I did it again with a bunch of nuts again. And then I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm coming down." So when I came down, not having said anything to them, they were backing away from me like I must have been possessed or something. I said, "Look, you got a squirrel." And they didn't believe me. So one at a time, I took them upstairs to the attic. I let the other one be downstairs, and I let each of them roll the nuts and confirm that somehow the acoustics of the floor and the attic had magnified the sound of the nuts bouncing to sound like footsteps. So this story is in my paranormal casebook. I've titled it "Footsteps in the Attic or Nuts to You," after Rocky and Bullwinkle. The guy did kind of close up the hole. He threw all the nuts outside. I felt bad for the squirrel, but what are you going to do? All right, let's go back to an actual ghost case here. I've had some very funny cases from time to time, I have to say. Some of them are pretty bizarre. One of the cases I had, which will be in the next volume of the casebook, was a case. It was actually brought to me by someone I knew. She was the sister-in-law of one of my friends, somebody I had worked with in the 1980s at LexisNexis. And I'd had Thanksgiving with them, with their family a couple of times, a few times actually, 80s and you may think it possibly in the 90s as well. So I knew her a bit. I knew her husband, and she and the kids bought this house in Hayward, California. And they called me because it turned out their house was haunted. Now, they weren't freaked out, except they were a little angry that the ghost, who they were pretty sure was the guy who used to live in the house, who owned the house originally, he was basically harassing them to move out of the house. It was his house. We hear those kinds of stories once in a while, but they were not going to move. And they also knew from me, having talked to me many times, that they shouldn't be afraid of ghosts. So I brought a psychic with me, and we went over to the house. Before I went, however, they had got me the phone number of the widow of this guy, because the guy had died. He actually died in the house. He died of cancer in home hospice in the house. The wife had moved to a nearby town, to Vallejo, California. And one of the things that's important about this house is that there had been a lot of additions and reconstruction in the house. He'd done a lot of remodeling in the house. So he really put himself in the house. In other words, this really was his house. It wasn't just a house they painted. It was a house he did a lot of work on. And then he died of cancer in the house. So she moved to Vallejo. So I was able to get the phone number from these folks and talk to the widow. And she said, well, this doesn't make any sense. He's showing up here with me. He visits me quite often. All right, so he's harassing the people in his old house. He's visiting his widow in Vallejo. It's not that far away. I had to get timing. So I got the information before going out there as to sometimes, or a general idea, when he shows up in the house in Hayward and when he shows up visiting the widow. And they were not the same times. In other words, he seemed like he was apparently splitting his time and splitting his bets because he wanted them out of the house. I don't know what for, but it happens. So Maria Lagana, the medium I worked with at the time, came with me. We went through the house. We talked to the family quite a bit. And then Maria actually connected with this guy. And I had not told her much about the situation other than the ghost was bothering them. So she gets this information about how much he put into the house, and he feels like his wife shouldn't have left, and really he wants the house back for her, on and on and on. And he was just simply not willing at first to entertain moving away. It's like, well, you're visiting your wife already. You want to be with your wife. Why don't you go to your wife? It's like, no, I got to do something here as well. So I suggested something to Maria. Now, this is something that came out of a seance that we had, a communication session I had with Annette Martin and a group of people and the ghost of the Moss Beach Distillery restaurant a few years before. I said to Maria, okay, if you should ask him, or maybe he'll just hear me. Was there anything when you were alive that you never got to do before you died? Bucket list kind of stuff. Was there anything? And Maria looked at me like I was nuts. I didn't prepare her for this. So she's listening and she's looking quizzically, and then she starts laughing. I said, what's so funny? She said, I don't know why you asked that, but he says he's always wanted to go on safari in Africa, like a photographic safari. Okay. So you can't carry a camera, but memories. You can go to Africa. You can get in the face of the damn lion, and the lion can't do anything to you. You're a ghost. You can approach the animals. They may react to you, but you don't have to worry about being hurt. You can do a better safari than any of the safaris could take you on. Those tours can take you on. All you have to do is think yourself there, or if you need to, hop a plane, take a boat, just stow away. Nobody can see you, or most people can't see you. So Maria, again, is looking at me like I'm nuts, and she's listening, and she says, he says that sounds like a good idea? like with a question mark at the end. Shortly after that, he did not come back to the house. In fact, he never came back to that house. The widow said, because I spoke to her a little while later, she said, he hasn't been showing up here. I said, well, we sent him on safari. I had to explain the whole situation to her. A couple of years later, he did start showing up at his wife's place, not at the house in Hayward, however. He was done with that, fortunately. So, Annette Martin and I used to talk, because we use this kind of solution in other places as well, that it's really interesting that it's communication with apparitions, with ghosts, to help move them away, whether it's moving them on, giving them instruction on how to move to the other side or let themselves go, or it's, hey, maybe you're not ready to go yet, but there's a whole wide world out there you can see. What I'm suggesting, folks, is be a travel agent for ghosts. It does seem to work. All right, we only have a couple minutes left. Susanna, let's see, live in a complex compiled of elderly and disabled people, been here 18 years. 40 people have died during that period. Check occasionally. No one has had any kind of experience here. Years ago, a woman saw her daughter walking across a quad toward her just before she died. I don't think that the majority of people don't stick around. And, certain complexes, I would say it's probably more likely that somebody who dies in a complex, my mother's in assisted living, for example, she's not going to stick around there after she dies. If anything, she's going to try to find my father, but she's also possibly going to pop in on her kids and grandkids at some point. So there has to be an emotional tie to a location, to people, to really want to stay there, or a fear of moving. So if somebody's afraid to leave the place, I could see them sticking around, but otherwise not so much. Yeah, it would have been good to actually find out if he had a good safari. I can't imagine he had a bad safari. Again, nothing can hurt you at that point. And actually, one of the questions I've gotten asked over the years is, what are you going to do when you're dead? Well, unless I somehow get drawn to the other side, like I'm not allowed to stay here for whatever reason. I don't know if that's a rule, but I'm planning on doing a little travel. I know you don't, because of these cases where apparitions can travel. If an apparition is only in one place, they are keeping themselves there because it never occurred to them they can leave. That's important. So I'm going to travel around the world, and hey, you see what I'm wearing? I'm going out there. I'm going to explore where no one has gone before. Well, there may have been other people who've gone before. In fact, Ingo Swann, a very famous psychic, in his 1976-75 book, To Kiss Earth Goodbye, wrote about traveling out of body to Jupiter and Saturn. So if he could do it when he was still alive as an out-of-body presence, I'm pretty sure I can do it as a ghost. So in terms of getting there quickly, I don't know whether this is something I can just think and just snap my spirit fingers and just be there, or whether it's going to have to be traveling the speed of light or thought. That'll take a long time, unfortunately. But maybe not. We'll see. All right, we're coming toward the end anyway. I just want to wish everybody a very happy Halloween. What are folks doing? Anybody want to pop in what they're doing for Halloween? I'm going to a party that night. Susanna, you're going to get in some mischief. That's good. That's really good. We don't get trick-or-treaters here much, so we go to other people's parties in general. So I hope folks are going to have a really good Halloween. If you're staying home, I hope you do get a lot of trick-or-treaters. It's always fun to see kids or adults dressed up. I would take either, but we have a really steep hill in our cul-de-sac, so we're not going to see too many people. James, you're going to watch horror movies? Okay, that's fair. We're going to a house that's almost always all year decked out for Halloween. It's just a little extra stuff. But King Diamond concert for Graveyard Grog. Okay. Concert probably will be pretty cool, too. All right, everybody. I hope you have a great Halloween. Have a good couple of weeks. I will see you again in 2 weeks for questions and answers on November 10th. Happy Halloween. Good night.